If I had to choose one measurement to predict who will develop diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver, or even dementia in the next decade, it wouldn't be your weight, and it wouldn't be your BMI. It would be the simple circumference of your waist. Here's why. Your weight can't tell you where your fat is stored, but your waist size gives you a direct signal about the fat wrapped around your internal organs, the fat that is metabolically active and quietly driving inflammation throughout your body. Before I go further, a quick note. This is educational content, not medical advice. If you have concerns about your weight or health, please talk to your own doctor. Now, let's understand what's really happening here. Most of us have stood on a scale and had our weight turned into a BMI number. Above 25 means overweight. Above 30 means obese. It seems simple. But here is what most people don't know. BMI was never designed to diagnose health. It was created in the 1800s by a Belgian mathematician studying populations, not individuals. It was a tool for statistics, not a personal health metric. And it has a fundamental flaw. BMI cannot tell the difference between fat and muscle, and it cannot tell you where your fat is located. A rugby player with lots of muscle might have a BMI of 28, technically overweight, but virtually no health risk. Meanwhile, someone with a normal BMI of 23 might carry significant fat around their midsection and be at high metabolic risk. The scale treats all weight the same, but biology does not. To understand why waist size matters, you need to know that your body stores fat in two completely different compartments, and they are not created equal. The first is subcutaneous fat. That is the fat you can pinch just beneath your skin on your arms, legs, or hips. It stores energy and is relatively inert. Some of it is even protective, especially fat stored in the lower body. The second compartment is visceral fat. This is the fat that wraps around your internal organs, your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, even your heart. You cannot see it from the outside, and you cannot pinch it, but it is there, deep inside your abdomen. But a rugby player with a BMI of 28 might be perfectly healthy. Meanwhile, someone with a BMI of 23 could be in serious metabolic trouble. To understand why, you need to know your body stores fat in two completely different compartments. The first is subcutaneous fat, the soft, pinchable fat just under your skin on your arms, hips, and thighs. It stores energy but causes little metabolic trouble. The second is visceral fat, the hidden fat wrapped around your liver, pancreas, intestines, and even your heart. You can't see it or pinch it, but it's there. Unlike subcutaneous fat, visceral fat is metabolically hyperactive. It doesn't just sit there quietly, it behaves like an endocrine organ, pumping out inflammatory molecules that interfere with how your body processes glucose and manages inflammation. When you measure your waist circumference, you're getting a direct proxy for how much visceral fat you're carrying. That's why it predicts disease risk so accurately. Let me walk you through what visceral fat actually does biologically. Once you understand the mechanism, everything else starts to make sense. Visceral fat cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that travel through your bloodstream, triggering chronic low-grade inflammation throughout your body. They interfere with insulin signaling in your muscles and liver, making your cells less responsive to insulin. Your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin just to get the same job done. But here's where it gets fascinating. Visceral fat doesn't just sit there. It behaves like an endocrine organ, pumping out hormones and inflammatory molecules that interfere with how your body processes glucose. When you measure your waist circumference, you're getting a direct proxy for how much visceral fat you're carrying, and that's why it predicts disease risk so accurately. Let me walk you through what visceral fat actually does biologically, because once you understand the mechanism, everything else starts to make sense. Visceral fat cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that travel through your bloodstream and trigger chronic low-grade inflammation throughout your body. They interfere with insulin signaling in your muscles and your liver. They make your cells less responsive to insulin. Your pancreas then has to produce more and more insulin just to get the same job done. Now, at the same time, visceral fat constantly releases free fatty acids directly into the portal vein, the big vein that drains straight into your liver. Your liver gets bombarded with fat and starts accumulating it inside its cells, a condition called fatty liver. And a fatty liver doesn't just sit there harmlessly. It becomes insulin resistant, which means it stops responding to insulin signals to stop producing glucose. So your liver keeps churning out sugar even when your blood sugar is already high. It also ramps up production of triglycerides, which increases your cardiovascular risk. And here's where it compounds. High insulin levels tell your body to store more fat. When insulin is chronically elevated, your body preferentially stores that fat as visceral fat. You end up in a vicious cycle that's incredibly difficult to break without changing the underlying inputs. This constant flood of free fatty acids bombards your liver through the portal vein, the direct highway from your gut to your liver. Your liver cells start filling up with fat it was never designed to hold. This is fatty liver, and it is not a harmless condition. A fatty liver becomes insulin resistant. It stops listening to insulin's signal to stop making sugar, so it keeps churning out glucose even when your blood sugar is already high. At the same time, the fatty liver ramps up production of triglycerides, sending more fat into your bloodstream and increasing your cardiovascular risk. High insulin levels then tell your body to store even more fat, and it preferentially stores that new fat right back where it came from, your visceral compartment. You end up in a vicious cycle. More visceral fat means more inflammation, more insulin resistance, and even more fat storage. It is incredibly difficult to break without changing the inputs. This cascading metabolic dysfunction starts in your abdomen and radiates outward, affecting your liver, your blood vessels, your brain, and ultimately your lifespan. Large studies involving hundreds of thousands of people have consistently shown that waist circumference predicts risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease far better than BMI does. Even when you compare two people with the same weight and height, the person with a larger waist has significantly worse health outcomes. One major study from the Mayo Clinic followed over 650,000 adults and found that larger waist size meant higher mortality risk at every BMI category, even normal weight. This is why doctors are increasingly moving away from weight-based assessments and focusing on waist circumference, waist-to-hip ratio, and body composition instead. And that brings us to a group that flies completely under the radar using traditional weight-based metrics, despite being at serious metabolic risk. These individuals have a normal BMI, say 22 or 23, but they carry significant fat around their midsection and have very little muscle mass. From the outside, they look slim. On paper, their weight is fine, but metabolically, they're in serious trouble. They often have high triglycerides, elevated fasting insulin, fatty liver, and poor glucose tolerance. They might have normal cholesterol, but a terrible HDL to triglyceride ratio. They're insulin resistant despite being thin, and because their weight doesn't raise any red flags, they're not screened, not warned, and not treated until something serious happens. You can look thin and be metabolically sick, and that's precisely why waist circumference is such a powerful screening tool. It catches the people that weight-based metrics miss. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening inside your body with this hidden fat. Visceral fat cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that travel through your bloodstream and trigger chronic low-grade inflammation throughout your entire body. They interfere with insulin signaling in your muscles and your liver. They make your cells less responsive to insulin, so your pancreas has to produce more and more just to get the same job done. Your pancreas then has to work overtime, pumping out more and more insulin just to get the same job done. Meanwhile, visceral fat constantly dumps free fatty acids directly into your portal vein, the big vein that drains straight into your liver. Your liver gets bombarded with this fat and starts accumulating it inside its cells, a condition called fatty liver. Now, a fatty liver doesn't just sit there harmlessly. It becomes insulin resistant, meaning it stops listening to insulin's signal to stop producing sugar, so your liver keeps churning out glucose even when your blood sugar is already high, which only makes things worse. It also ramps up production of triglycerides, which increases your cardiovascular risk. And here's where it compounds. High insulin levels tell your body to store more fat, and when insulin is chronically high, your body preferentially stores it as visceral fat. You end up in this vicious cycle that's incredibly difficult to break without changing the underlying inputs. Now, here's the part that flips everything on its head. That same visceral fat, the one wreaking havoc inside you, is also the first to surrender when you change your inputs. It's like an alarm system that's loud, but also quick to reset. Large studies involving hundreds of thousands of people have consistently shown that waist circumference predicts the risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease much better than BMI does. But here's what happens next. The liver, now stuffed with fat, stops listening to insulin's signal to stop producing sugar. So your liver keeps churning out glucose, even when your blood sugar is already high. It's like a factory that never gets the memo to stop production. And this is the vicious cycle. High insulin tells your body to store more fat, and when insulin is chronically high, your body stores it as visceral fat. This cascading metabolic dysfunction starts in your abdomen and radiates outward. It affects your liver, your blood vessels, your brain, and ultimately your lifespan. Large studies, like one from the Mayo Clinic that followed over 650,000 adults, show that waist size predicts death risk better than BMI at every weight category. The reason is simple. Waist size reflects visceral fat, and visceral fat drives metabolic disease. The scale can't see the difference, but a tape measure can. This brings us to a group of people who fly completely under the radar. They have a normal BMI, but they carry significant fat around their midsection. These individuals often have high triglycerides, elevated fasting insulin, and fatty liver, despite looking slim. They are insulin resistant, even though they are thin. Because their weight doesn't raise red flags, they are not screened, they are not warned, they are not treated until something serious happens, like a heart attack or diabetes. You can look thin and be metabolically sick. That is precisely why waist circumference is such a powerful screening tool. It catches the people that weight-based metrics miss. This chronic inflammation stiffens your blood vessels, making them less flexible and less able to regulate pressure properly. Visceral fat also produces a molecule called angiotensinogen, which gets converted into angiotensin II, a powerful vasoconstrictor that squeezes your blood vessels tighter. So the fat around your organs isn't passive. It's actively secreting hormones and inflammatory signals that push your blood pressure up. This is why hypertension often emerges alongside other metabolic problems. It's not a separate disease. It's part of the same underlying dysfunction that begins with visceral fat and insulin resistance. Reducing your waist size doesn't just improve your metabolic markers. It often brings your blood pressure down without medication. And now the effects of visceral fat extend all the way to your brain. Insulin resistance doesn't just affect your muscles and your liver, it affects your brain cells too. Your brain relies on insulin signaling for memory formation and synaptic plasticity. When that signaling is impaired, cognitive function declines. Studies using MRI imaging have shown that people with higher waist circumference tend to have smaller hippocampal volumes, the part of your brain responsible for memory and learning. One study published in the Journal of Neurology followed nearly 7,000 people and found that those with the largest waist circumference had significantly higher dementia risk, even after adjusting for other factors. The pathway is clear. Central fat leads to vascular and metabolic injury, which leads to brain inflammation and degeneration, which leads to cognitive decline. Your waist size today is shaping your brain health decades from now. Your waist size today is shaping your brain health decades from now, and that changes the stakes completely. We're talking about protecting your ability to think, to remember, and to function independently as you age. That's the real prize. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I'm naturally broad-shouldered, so of course my waist will be bigger. That's a fair point. Waist size isn't just an absolute number. Context matters. What we're really looking at is waist circumference relative to your height. This is why researchers prefer waist-to-height ratio. The guideline is simple. Your waist in centimeters should be less than half your height in centimeters. For those who are naturally petite but carry fat around the middle, the absolute number might look fine on paper. But relative to your height, it could still indicate excess visceral fat. This is where looking at other markers becomes really useful. Things like your fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and blood pressure. If those numbers are off, even with a normal waist size, it tells you something about what's happening metabolically. Your body composition matters more than hitting some generic cutoff. And here's what makes me quite angry. Obesity rates have skyrocketed, and we've been told it's a failure of personal responsibility. But humans didn't suddenly lose discipline in 1980. What changed was the food environment. Ultra-processed foods became cheap, ubiquitous, and aggressively marketed. These foods are engineered to override your body's natural satiety signals. But here is the good news, the part that should give you real hope. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it is also highly responsive to change. When you start eating in a way that stabilizes your blood sugar and lowers your insulin, visceral fat is often the first fat to go. It shrinks faster than subcutaneous fat. Even modest lifestyle changes, improving your diet, increasing your protein, adding some resistance training, improving your sleep, all of these preferentially reduce visceral fat before you see changes anywhere else. This is why people often notice their waist shrinking before the scale moves significantly. You are losing the dangerous fat first, your liver starts to clear out, your insulin sensitivity improves, your inflammation drops. All of this happens relatively quickly, often within weeks of making consistent changes. Biology is not fixed, it is dynamic. And visceral fat, because it is so metabolically active, is one of the most changeable aspects of your physiology. Now, if I had to give you the four most powerful levers for reducing visceral fat, they would be these. The first one is stabilizing your blood sugar. That means prioritizing whole foods, minimizing refined carbohydrates, and avoiding the insulin spikes that drive storage. The second lever is prioritizing protein and fiber. Protein keeps you full, preserves muscle mass, and has a high thermic effect. Fiber slows down glucose absorption and feeds your gut bacteria, which produce metabolites that improve insulin sensitivity. So, let's bring this back to ultra-processed foods. What do they do metabolically? Because this is where visceral fat accumulation actually happens. These foods are typically low in protein and fiber, which are the two nutrients that keep you full. They're high in refined carbohydrates and seed oils, which cause rapid spikes in blood glucose and large insulin responses. And as we've already seen, chronically high insulin specifically promotes visceral fat storage. Ultra-processed foods also often come in liquid form. Things like Coke or Fanta or fruit juices or smoothies, energy drinks. Liquid calories don't trigger the same satiety response as solid food, so you consume far more energy without feeling full. On top of that, these foods are engineered to have what's called a bliss point, the perfect combination of sugar, salt, and fat that maximizes pleasure and minimizes satiety signaling. Your brain lights up like you've taken a drug, literally, and you keep eating well past nutritional needs. The result here is chronic calorie surplus, chronic insulin elevation, and preferential storage of fat in the visceral compartment. It's not a moral failure, it's a biological response to an unnatural food environment. But here's the good news. Here's the part that should give you hope. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it's also highly responsive to change. Petite frame, same risk. A woman who's 5'2" with a 32-inch waist might pass every BMI check, but her waist-to-height ratio is above 0.5 and her liver may already be storing fat it cannot burn. Even modest lifestyle changes, things like improving your diet, increasing your protein intake, adding resistance training, improving your sleep, all of these preferentially reduce visceral fat before you see changes anywhere else. This is why people often notice their waist shrinking before the scale moves significantly. You're losing the dangerous fat first. Your liver starts to clear out, your insulin sensitivity improves, your inflammation drops. All of this happens relatively quickly, often within weeks of making consistent changes. The first lever is stabilizing your blood sugar. That means cutting out the refined carbs that spike insulin and tell your body to store visceral fat. The second lever is protein and fiber. Protein keeps you full and preserves muscle. Fiber slows glucose absorption and feeds your gut bacteria, which improve insulin sensitivity. Third is resistance training. Building muscle increases your metabolic rate and helps your body store energy as glycogen instead of fat. You become more insulin sensitive. The fourth lever is sleep and stress regulation. Poor sleep raises cortisol, impairs glucose tolerance, and increases hunger hormones. You can't outrun bad sleep. These aren't diet tricks, they're physiological optimization strategies. They work because they address root causes, insulin resistance, inflammation, and metabolic dysfunction. One of the most frustrating things I see is people making real progress. Their clothes fit better, their waist is smaller, but the scale hasn't moved. They think they're failing. What's actually happening is body recomposition, losing fat and gaining muscle at the same rate. Muscle is denser than fat, so your weight stays stable but you're leaner. That's why waist circumference is a better marker of progress than scale weight. Your waist reflects visceral fat, metabolic health, and disease risk. The scale just tells you your relationship with gravity. Measure your waist, track how your clothes fit, pay attention to energy, sleep, and strength. Those are the metrics that matter, not a number on the scale. There's some argument that waist circumference should be treated like a vital sign, like blood pressure or HbA1c. It's measurable, modifiable, and predictive of long-term health. And here's what makes me quite angry when we talk about these sorts of things. Obesity rates have skyrocketed over the past 50 years, and we've been told it's a failure of personal responsibility. People just need more willpower, more discipline, and more self-control. But humans didn't suddenly lose discipline in 1980. What changed was the food environment. Ultra-processed foods became cheap, ubiquitous, and aggressively marketed. These foods are engineered to override your body's natural satiety signals. They're hyperpalatable, they're calorie-dense, they're designed to make you want more. They're sold in massive portions, advertised to children, and placed at eye level in every single supermarket and petrol station. You can't go anywhere without seeing an advert for something that looks delicious. You aren't weak for struggling against this system. You're human. You don't blame somebody's lungs for getting cancer after decades of cigarette advertising. You recognize that the environment shaped the outcome. Well, the same is true here. Addictive inputs create predictable outcomes, and until we acknowledge that, we'll keep blaming individuals for systemic failures, and governments of all colors are guilty of this. And this brings me to something really crucial. Fat shaming doesn't work. Shame does not motivate sustainable change. Shame raises cortisol, it worsens stress, it triggers emotional eating, and it drives people away from healthcare. People live with obesity, people live with larger bodies, and every single one of those people deserves dignity. They deserve respect and compassionate healthcare at every size. But pretending that visceral fat is biologically harmless is also not compassionate. It's not kind to withhold information that could help someone understand their body and make informed decisions. You can respect people and also acknowledge biology at the same time. What I'm offering here is not judgment of any sort. It's physiology, and physiology is neutral. Your body doesn't care about your intentions or your efforts. It responds to inputs. And if we can understand those inputs, then we can change the outputs. So measure your waist today, not for vanity, but for data. A tape measure costs nothing and tells you more than a scale ever will. Increased risk generally starts above 94 centimeters for men and 80 for women, though this varies by ethnicity. South Asian populations carry higher risk at smaller waist sizes, but these numbers need to be considered relative to your height. A 95 centimeter waist on someone who's 6'4" is different from the same measurement on someone who's 5'6". Here's the guideline. Your waist in centimeters should be less than half your height in centimeters. If you're 180 centimeters tall, your waist should ideally be below 90. For those who are petite but carry fat around the middle, the absolute number might look fine on paper, but relative to your height, it could still indicate excess visceral fat. This is where looking at other markers becomes useful: your fasting glucose, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, blood pressure. If those are off, even with a normal waist size, something is happening metabolically. Your body composition matters more than hitting some generic cutoff. And here's the key. This isn't about reaching an arbitrary number to feel worthy. It's about having a feedback signal. Just like you wouldn't ignore rising blood pressure, you shouldn't ignore a rising waistline. It's not just a normal part of getting older. It's your body telling you something about what's happening inside. Feedback signals exist so you can respond, adjust, and improve. There's no moral judgment in a tape measure. It's just data, and data, when you understand it, gives you power. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it's also highly responsive to change. You're not sentenced to poor metabolic health because of your genetics or your past. Now here's the part that should give you real hope. Visceral fat is metabolically active, which means it's also highly responsive to change. When you start eating in a way that stabilizes your blood sugar and lowers your insulin, visceral fat is often the first fat to go. It shrinks faster than subcutaneous fat. Even modest lifestyle changes, improving your diet, increasing your protein intake, adding resistance training, improving your sleep, all of these preferentially reduce visceral fat before you see changes anywhere else. Your waist measurement is a conversation starter with your doctor. At your next checkup, ask for a fasting insulin test alongside your standard labs. It reveals how hard your pancreas is working to keep your blood sugar in check. That number, combined with your waist size, gives you a clearer picture of your metabolic engine than any scale ever could. Biology is not fixed, it's dynamic. And visceral fat, because it's so metabolically active, is one of the most changeable aspects of your physiology. You're not sentenced to poor metabolic health because of your genetics or your past. You can change the inputs, you can shift the system, you can reduce visceral fat, improve insulin sensitivity, lower inflammation, and dramatically reduce your risk of chronic disease. Measure it, get a tape measure and understand it, and then do something about it. Not so you look a certain way, but because you deserve to feel good, you deserve to think clearly, and you deserve to live as long and as well as possible. This video is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making changes to your health, diet, or medication. Remember that feeling of waking up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom, or that tightness in your belt after a meal? That wasn't just aging, that was your body sending a signal, and now you know what that signal means and what to do about it. Your waist size today is a signal, not a sentence. It's data. And data, when you understand it, gives you power. You have the power to change the inputs, shift the system, and protect your health for decades to come. If this helped you understand your body a little better, please subscribe. It helps more people find this information. And remember, you deserve to feel good, think clearly, and live well. I'll see you in the next one.